The American Revolution iMovie, produced by Thomas Zetino, Alex Flores, and Roddy. During the 1760s, Americans had not yet become an independent nation and were still under British rule. Although the British aided the Americans in many aspects, such as reduced taxation compared to the British mainlanders and safety from foreign conquerors, the Americans were unable to attain their own identity. As Thomas Paine argues, the American people had grown up and no longer needed the guidance of their British parents. Therefore, they deserved to relinquish themselves of British subjugation and create an independent nation, free of British regulations, with new American identity. The Americans were living somewhat of a privileged life. They were not under attack from any other countries. They had the second best economy in the world, and they were being sustained by the most powerful country in the world. However, America was still considered subordinate and inferior to Britain. Thomas Paine, a political theorist, revolutionary, and American immigrant, argued that America was like a child which has to grow up and be its own individual. Paine believed that Britain had nurtured this baby, called America, for too long now, and believed that the time had allowed the now adult America to fend for itself. Colonists could not express their views politically or economically because of the lack of representation in the English Parliament. Certainly, there was a lack of autonomy present in the Americas. The Americans were virtually represented. Every decision they made would have to go through the British Parliament 1,000 miles away. Therefore, the British Parliament could dictate American life, making sure their subordination was evident. As Thomas Paine emphasized, it's absurd for an island to rule a continent. Essentially, the colonists wanted to directly represent themselves. Along with being virtually represented by the English Parliament, Americans could not become autonomous and prosper because they were not able to trade freely. Mercantilism, which involved exporting more goods than you imported and trading amongst many other countries to acquire wealth to build up your country, had taken the world by storm, and America hoped to join in on the mercantile frenzy. However, Britain obviated any chance of America having free trade due to the British shedding restrictions on the Americans. For example, a sensible trading partner for the Americans would have been the French, who inhabited land to the west and north of the colonies. However, the British established the Navigation Acts, which restricted trade to France, limiting the Americans from gaining other major trading partners other than Britain. Also, the British employed the Revenue Act of 1766, which they said would help regulate trade. However, it ended up in taxing goods being imported into the colonies, thus making the colonies exporting profit less. Additionally, the Tea Act upset the colonists because they saw this as an economic intrusion that allowed the East India Tea Company to monopolize the tea. This then led to what is known as the Boston Tea Party. As a result of the outcome of the Tea Act, a few more final acts had been passed. These acts include the Intolerable Acts, which made the Americans pay back for all the damages, the Quartering Acts, the Justice Acts, and the Boston Port Act. These new acts further infuriated the Americans because they felt further suppressed by the British authority. As a result, even if America was the second best economy in the world at the time, as a result of mercantilism and British economic ideals, Americans were still placed as subordinates to the British and were unhappy as a result. Many Americans believed during this time that if they had the economic freedom, they could have had a chance to become the best economy in the world due to not being suppressed by the British. American subordination was also apparent in the acquisition of land. First, the British instituted the Proclamation of 1763, which prevented Americans from settling west of the Allegheny Mountain Range. Britain claimed that the U.S. would be setting off treaties and starting wars if they were to overstep the boundaries. However, on a grander scale, the principle behind the proclamation was to restrict the Americans. As J. Franklin Jameson says in The Effects of the American Revolution, from westward expansion and formation of new interior colonies. More land equaled more power. Therefore, the British limited American expansion to prevent America from growing stronger. Secondly, Jameson touches upon the idea of a quit rent, which was a form of a property tax that corresponded to the amount of land owned by someone, paid directly to the king. Considering most of the population in the colonies lived in rural areas and were not at the top of the social hierarchy because of this, the large sums of money needed to pay the quit rent resulted in, as Jameson says, a limitation on the ready acquisition of land. Lastly, another burden on Americans, which hindered them in acquiring land as well as wealth from the land, touched upon in the Jameson document, was a land provision instituted by the British. The provision required landowners to provide Britain with an ample supply of timber from American colonists' property, and also prevented these landowners from cutting any trees down without the consent of a British surveyor. The provision was an intrusion of American landowning rights which bounded the Americans to subjugation because they could not attain power or wealth through land. To conclude, ultimately, without the American Revolution, America would never have been able to get out of the British tyrant's firm grip. The Revolution shaped our nation and resulted in an American identity that still stands with us today.